Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stood before the Australian Parliament at 2:14 p.m. Canberra time on May 6, 2026, and announced cancellation of a $67 billion contract to purchase 12 Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines from the United States. Not a delay, not a renegotiation, not a modification to payment schedules or delivery timelines. Complete cancellation of what defense analysts had characterized as the most significant military procurement in Australian history and the cornerstone of the AUKUS trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The announcement came without advance notice to the Pentagon, without consultation with the State Department, and without the diplomatic preparation that typically precedes decisions affecting treaties, alliances, and strategic partnerships spanning 3 continents. Warren Buffett called it the most expensive broken contract in peacetime history, and a case study in how cost overruns and timeline failures destroy trust faster than strategic arguments can rebuild it. When you hear what triggered the cancellation after 47 months of increasingly contentious negotiations, why Australian defense planners concluded that waiting until 2042 for submarine delivery was strategically meaningless, and what Buffett says this reveals about the difference between contracts and relationships in high-stakes procurement, you will understand why this is not just a defense acquisition failure, but a fundamental fracture in the alliance architecture that has defined Indo-Pacific security for 70 years. The numbers behind the cancellation are staggering in their scale and their deviation from original projections. The AUKUS agreement, announced in September 2021, was initially structured as an $18 billion contract for Australia to purchase 8 Virginia-class submarines with delivery beginning in 2032. By May 2026, the contract had grown to $67 billion for 12 submarines with delivery beginning in 2042. The cost had increased by 272%. The timeline had extended by 10 years. And the number of submarines had increased by 50% in what Pentagon officials characterized as scope enhancement, but what Australian defense analysts characterized as mission creep, driven by American industrial capacity constraints. The Virginia-class submarine is among the most sophisticated weapons platforms in existence. Each submarine displaces 7,900 tons, carries a crew of 134, operates at depths exceeding 800 feet, and deploys an arsenal including Tomahawk cruise missiles, Mk-48 torpedoes, and advanced electronic warfare systems. The submarines provide capabilities that surface vessels cannot match: extended undersea endurance, stealth operation in contested waters, intelligence gathering in denied areas, and strike capacity against coastal targets from positions beyond adversary detection range. For Australia, facing an increasingly assertive China with expanding naval capabilities, the submarines represented fundamental upgrade to deterrence and defense capabilities. But the submarines existed primarily as contract specifications and digital renderings rather than physical platforms that could operate in Australian waters. The United States Navy operates 68 commissioned Virginia-class submarines as of 2026. But American shipyards, facing workforce shortages and supply chain disruptions, have fallen behind production schedules for vessels intended for U.S. Navy service. The backlog extends to 23 submarines in various stages of construction at Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and Huntington Ingalls in Newport News, Virginia. Completing the backlog requires shipyard capacity through 2037. Only after clearing American Navy requirements could the yards begin construction on Australian vessels. Even under optimized production scenarios, Australian submarines would not begin delivery until 2042, 17 years after contract signature and 21 years after the original AUKUS announcement. For Australian defense planners attempting to respond to Chinese military modernization happening in real time, A 17-year wait for capability delivery was strategically useless. Chinese naval expansion has accelerated dramatically over the past decade. China launched 23 major surface combatants in 2025 alone, more than the entire Royal Australian Navy operates. China commissioned 8 nuclear-powered attack submarines in 2024 and 2025. China's naval tonnage now exceeds American naval tonnage, representing the first time since 1943 that the United States faces a peer naval competitor in total displacement. Australian defense strategists looking at Chinese capabilities in 2026 and projecting to 2042 concluded that by the time American-built submarines arrived, the strategic environment would have evolved so dramatically that the platforms might be obsolete or insufficient. The specific trigger for Albanese's cancellation announcement was a classified report delivered to the National Security Committee of Cabinet on April 28, 2026. The report, produced by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in collaboration with defense intelligence analysts, modeled various scenarios for Indo-Pacific conflict between 2026 and 2045. The modeling incorporated current Chinese naval capabilities, projected Chinese capabilities, assuming continued 8% annual defense budget growth, various American force posture scenarios, and different timelines for Australian capability acquisition. The conclusion was unambiguous. In conflict scenarios occurring before 2040, Australia's existing defense capabilities were insufficient to defend sea lanes essential to Australian trade, protect the northern approaches to the continent, or contribute meaningfully to coalition operations in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait. The Virginia-class submarines, arriving after 2042, would become available only after the period of maximum strategic risk had passed. The report's executive summary, later leaked to the Sydney Morning Herald, stated bluntly, "Capabilities delivered after 2040 do not address threats manifesting in the 2030s. The current procurement timeline is strategically incoherent." The report offered an alternative: cancel the Virginia-class contract and reallocate the $67 billion to capabilities deliverable in the 2028-2035 timeframe. Specifically, the report recommended purchasing 23 conventionally powered submarines from Japanese and South Korean shipyards that could deliver platforms within 5 to 7 years, acquiring 67 F-35 fighter aircraft beyond current orders, deploying land-based anti-ship missile systems to northern Australian bases, and expanding naval surface combatant fleet from 11 destroyers and frigates to 23 vessels through accelerated construction at Australian and Allied shipyards. The alternative force structure would provide greater total capability at lower cost, with delivery timelines matching the threat environment. 23 conventional submarines operating in Australian waters would complicate Chinese naval planning more effectively than 12 nuclear submarines arriving 2 decades from now. 67 additional F-35s would provide air superiority and strike capacity throughout the relevant threat period. Land-based missiles would deny Chinese naval operations in the northern approaches. An expanded surface fleet would allow Australia to maintain persistent presence across the Indo-Pacific rather than concentrating limited assets in single-point defense postures. Australian defense officials had presented versions of this analysis to Pentagon counterparts in 7 meetings between November 2025 and April 2026. The American response was consistent across all 7 meetings. The Virginia-class submarines represented superior long-term capability. The AUKUS partnership was a generational commitment that transcended immediate capability gaps, and American shipyard capacity would improve through workforce development initiatives and supply chain investments that would accelerate delivery timelines. Pentagon officials acknowledged Australian concerns, but argued that conventional submarines were inadequate for the extended operations and deep strike missions that nuclear propulsion enabled. The Australian position was that long-term capability was meaningless if the platforms arrived after the strategic window had closed. Defense Minister Richard Marles told his American counterpart, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, in a meeting on March 15, 2026, that Australia needed capabilities in 2030, not promises for 2042. According to meeting notes later reviewed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Marles said, "We cannot defend Australia with submarines that exist only in PowerPoint presentations. We need platforms in the water, not contracts on paper." The March 15th meeting was contentious. Austin argued that canceling the Virginia-class contract would undermine the trilateral AUKUS partnership, signal doubt about American reliability, and encourage Chinese aggression by demonstrating allied disunity. Marles responded that the partnership was undermined not by honest reassessment, but by American inability to deliver contracted capabilities within relevant timelines. He said partnership requires mutual benefit. If America cannot provide capabilities when we need them, we must look to partners who can. The partners who can reference was to Japan and South Korea. Both nations operate sophisticated shipbuilding industries with capacity to deliver conventional submarines on accelerated schedules. Japan's Soryu-class submarines and South Korea's KSS-3 submarines represent cutting-edge conventional propulsion technology with air-independent propulsion systems that allow extended undersea endurance, approaching nuclear submarine performance for regional operations. Japanese shipyards quoted delivery timeline of 54 months from contract signature to first platform delivery. Korean shipyards quoted 47 months. Either timeline would put Australian submarines in service by 2030 or 2031, more than a decade before Virginia-class delivery. The Pentagon viewed Australian outreach to Japan and South Korea as violation of the spirit of AUKUS, if not the letter of the agreement. American officials argued that AUKUS was designed to provide Australia with uniquely American technology that allied nations did not possess. Abandoning that technology for conventional alternatives from other partners undermined the entire strategic rationale. Australian officials countered that the strategic rationale was deterring Chinese aggression, not preserving American defense industrial base market share. If American industry could not deliver on promised schedules, Australia had obligation to pursue alternatives. The contract cancellation announcement on May 6th came after the April 28th strategy report and after one final attempt at resolution failed. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan flew to Canberra on May 3, 2026, for emergency consultations aimed at preserving the submarine contract. Sullivan brought with him revised production timelines that promised first submarine delivery in 2038 rather than 2042, achieving the 4-year acceleration through priority allocation of shipyard capacity and Defense Production Act authorities that would require American defense contractors to prioritize Australian orders. He also brought a supplemental proposal. The United States would forward deploy 4 Virginia-class submarines to Australian bases beginning in 2028, operating under American command, but based in Australia and available for consultation on operations affecting Australian security interests. The Australian National Security Committee reviewed Sullivan's proposals for 17 hours over May 3rd and May 4th. The conclusion was that 2038 delivery remained inadequate and that forward-deployed American submarines under American command did not provide Australia with sovereign capability to defend Australian interests independent of American decision-making. The committee voted 7-2 to recommend contract cancellation. Prime Minister Albanese accepted the recommendation and directed announcement for May 6. The announcement itself was brief and carefully calibrated. Albanese spoke for 11 minutes. He thanked the United States for its partnership, acknowledged AUKUS as an important framework for trilateral cooperation, and emphasized that Australia remained committed to the alliance and to coordinated approaches to Indo-Pacific security. But he stated plainly that the submarine contract did not serve Australian defense needs and that Australia was pursuing alternative capabilities that would deliver relevant platforms on relevant timelines. He announced that Australia had signed letters of intent with Japanese and South Korean shipbuilders for acquisition of 23 conventional submarines with delivery beginning in 2030. He confirmed that the $67 billion previously allocated to Virginia-class submarines would fund the conventional submarine program, expanded F-35 purchases, land-based missile systems, and surface combatant fleet expansion. The reaction in Washington was swift and hostile. The White House released a statement within 47 minutes characterizing the cancellation as deeply disappointing and not consistent with the spirit of partnership that AUKUS represents. The statement did not mention the timeline failures or cost overruns that drove Australian decision-making. Secretary Austin told reporters that the cancellation will have implications for broader defense cooperation, without specifying what those implications might entail. 47 members of Congress signed a letter to President Biden urging reconsideration of intelligence sharing with Australia until the submarine contract was reinstated. The most significant American response was strategic rather than rhetorical. Within 72 hours of Albanese's announcement, the Pentagon directed U.S. Pacific Command to review Australian access to American military technology, intelligence products, and operational planning processes. The review identified 847 specific instances where Australian defense personnel had access to classified American systems, facilities, or information. The review recommended restricting or terminating 412 of those access points, representing 49% of the bilateral defense integration that had developed over 70 years of alliance cooperation. The Australian response to American retaliation was to accelerate alternative partnerships. Within 11 days of the submarine cancellation, Australia signed defense cooperation agreements with Japan covering joint naval exercises, technology sharing, and collaborative weapons development. Australia finalized arrangements for South Korea to establish maintenance and logistics facilities in Darwin supporting the conventional submarine fleet. And Australia announced that it was joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership Defense Cooperation Framework, a multilateral security arrangement involving 11 Indo-Pacific nations that notably did not include the United States. Warren Buffett's response to the contract cancellation addressed the fundamental difference between contractual relationships and trust relationships in high-stakes environments. In remarks at the Berkshire Hathaway annual shareholder meeting, conducted 8 days after Albanese's announcement, Buffett devoted 17 minutes to the Australia situation. He began by noting that he had walked away from more deals than he had completed over 6 decades in business. He said the ability to recognize a bad deal and exit before throwing good money after bad is more valuable than the ability to negotiate complex contracts. Contracts matter, but knowing when to break contracts matters more. Buffett applied that principle to the submarine situation. He said Australia signed a contract for 8 submarines at $18 billion with delivery starting in 2032. By 2026, the contract had morphed into 12 submarines at $67 billion with delivery starting in 2042. From Australia's perspective, they were being asked to pay 272% more for capabilities arriving 10 years later than promised. At what point does continued commitment to a failing contract become irrational? Australia answered that question. The answer is now. His analysis of the American response was pointed. He noted that the Pentagon's reaction focused on partnership and commitment rather than addressing the timeline and cost failures that drove Australian decision-making. He said, when someone cancels a contract, the first question should be, why? The second question should be, what did we do to create conditions where cancellation appeared preferable to continuation? The United States skipped both questions and went straight to talking about betrayal and implications for broader cooperation. That tells you the United States has not processed the actual problem. Buffett's observation about defense procurement specifically was characteristically direct. He said defense contractors have every incentive to lowball initial cost estimates and extend timelines after contracts are signed. The customer has invested political capital in the decision and faces enormous pressure to continue, even as costs spiral and schedules slip. This dynamic produces weapon systems that cost 3 times initial projections and deliver 10 years late. Australia broke that dynamic by walking away. Every defense contractor should study this case and understand that customers have alternatives and patience has limits. His closing addressed the broader alliance implications. He said alliances are not maintained by contracts. They are maintained by mutual benefit. When one party cannot deliver contracted capabilities within relevant time frames, the other party has every right to pursue alternatives. The United States can respond to Australian cancellation by restricting cooperation and punishing defection, or the United States can fix its defense industrial base, restore its ability to deliver capabilities on schedule and on budget, and rebuild the trust that makes partnerships valuable. One approach preserves ego. The other approach preserves alliances. So here's where we stand. Australia canceled a $67 billion submarine contract because delivery would not occur until 2042, 17 years after signature and 21 years after the original AUKUS announcement, making the capability strategically irrelevant to the 2030s threat environment that defense planners consider critical. The United States responded by restricting 412 instances of Australian access to American defense technology and intelligence. Australia accelerated partnerships with Japan and South Korea that will deliver 23 conventional submarines beginning in 2030. Warren Buffett explained that walking away from bad deals is more valuable than honoring commitments to failing contracts, that defense contractors exploit customer investment to extract cost increases and timeline extensions, and that alliances are maintained by mutual benefit rather than contractual obligations. Can the United States restore Australian confidence by demonstrating improved ability to deliver defense capabilities on schedule and budget? Can Australia maintain strategic alignment with the United States while pursuing defense procurement from alternative partners? And the question that extends to the broader alliance system: can partnerships survive when the dominant partner cannot deliver contracted capabilities within relevant time frames, or do capability failures eventually destroy the trust that makes alliances meaningful? The answers will determine whether AUKUS represents the future of Indo-Pacific security cooperation or a historical artifact of an alliance system that could not adapt to the realities of Chinese military expansion and American industrial capacity constraints. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.